Hello, I'm Susan Okereke and I'm a maths teacher with a keen interest in finding ways of improving maths education. Today I have the pleasure of interviewing Conrad Wolfram, author of the book, The Maths Fix. Hi Conrad, for people who
Hi,
don't know,
good to be here.
You're right. For people who don't know who you are and what you do, could you please introduce yourself?
Sure, so Conrad Wolfram, my day job has been building technology for about the last 30 years to do computations. That's maths to most people, and now data science and AI and all of those things. And we've done that through technology called Mathematica and Wolfram Alpha. And so my brother started the company, I started the European part of the company, and that's what I've been doing to try and make the machines as smart as possible to help us compute things. The evening job, essentially, is to try and get the human up to speed with this new world. So the idea is to try and make sure that now we've got this great technology for computing things, like both our technology and other people's, we as people can make the most of it, make better decisions in life, and get our education in shape for this AI age.
Brilliant. So this kind of leads quite well onto your book. So please, could you describe your book to people who might not have heard about it?
Sure. What I'm talking about in my book is really a fundamental change in the subject of mathematics. So everyone, whether you love maths or you loathe maths, right, you can't avoid it. So you are, for 10 years plus of your life, you are having to do maths at school. And you're told it's like the most crucial thing, pretty much, that you have to do for your future job, your future prospects. As you can tell from my background, I think maths is pretty important too. The problem is, I think that the subject in schools around the world, this isn't just in the UK, has gone off track with what we actually need in the real world. I think it's causing huge problems for everyone. And my book is about, really in 3 parts. It's about, okay, so why am I saying this? What's the problem? That's sort of part 1. Mm-hmm. Part 2 is, what curriculum am I proposing? What am I saying we should learn instead of the maths we're learning at the moment? And part 3 is, how do we make this change? You know, it's like maths is everywhere. It's in all schools. It's for years of our life. What do we actually do politically and in life and as individuals to try and get this to happen for us and our communities? And I suppose the central observation in my whole book is this. In real life, when you use mathematics, computers do almost all the calculating. Mm-hmm. It's very rare you as a person do the calculating nowadays. You might do a bit of estimating, but you mostly don't do calculating. What you do is set up the problems, understand the answers, try and be skeptical in the right way so that you get better decisions. That's what you ought to be doing. In maths education schools, almost all of your effort is on learning to calculate by hand. And you actually have very little effort spent on how to set up the problem, what it was that you wanted to make a decision about in the first place, and how to interpret the answer. And those two are diverging more and more. Mm. And if you want to ask, why does everyone find maths so impossible? Not everyone, most people, but why is maths always in trouble? Everybody's talking about maths education. The problem is it's the wrong subject for the real world, and that's what we've really got to fix. However well you teach it, it's still going to be somewhat the wrong subject.
Wow, so this is not a small concept. This is quite kind of this is radical thinking. As a math teacher who's kind of, going into the classroom, peddling the old stuff. So it's it's big thought. So what suggestions, I'm sort of thinking, you've been quite clear about why you've written it. What kind of inspired you to write it?
So I can't put an exact date on it, but I've been watching as our technology in particular, obviously I was in the middle of this because we're building technology, we're figuring out what people do with it. And I've been seeing in the real world the use of computation go forwards and forwards and forwards. And, it's been a major power in the last decades, right? Mm. Of how our lives are far more computational than they ever have been, every walk of life. And then I'm watching education and I'm thinking, but hang on just a moment, these changes aren't happening there. So we need data scientists in the real world, but there isn't any data science really in maths education in schools, right? Or I don't use a calculator in the real world. I use a computer to do things, right? But yet we're insisting everybody, well, if we're lucky, they use a calculator at all. Maybe they just do it by hand, right? But or they have to use a calculator, which I haven't seen calculators really used, in professional. So everything's got disjoint. So I've seen this sort of disjoint happening more and more. And so it really got crystallized when Wolfram Alpha came out, which is our technology. We just type in and very rough question and it'll produce an answer. And a lot of people use this from 2009 when it came out to, quote, cheat on their maths homework. And I remember giving a TED talk at the time, is it cheating to use Wolfram Alpha to do your maths homework? Well, that's an interesting question because it depends whether you think it's cheating to use modern technology, whether the questions are right, etc. So it got me thinking, and then a lot of people reacted saying, actually, Wolfram Alpha has totally changed how we think about it. So I thought, hey, this is the time to really crystallize these thoughts. And that's when I gave a bigger TED talk on the beginnings of computer-based maths. And then eventually that led to, we built a lot of stuff and I've given a lot of talks and things. And I thought, you know what, I've got to piece this all together. And the problem is, giving a 20-minute talk or something, people say, hey, yes, but have you thought about this? And it's like, yeah, we have thought about that, but I haven't told you that because I just gave you a 20-minute talk. So I thought I better write the whole thing down, put it in a big thing, which really goes through all of our thoughts we've had about every aspect of it. And that's really how the book came to be.
Wow. So you've sort of said it's been at least 10 years in the making, if not more. So yeah, the next question is, how long has it taken? It's taken.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting question because I think, in terms of ideas about this disconnect between teaching or maths education and real world, I think it's been very even longer than that, probably 15 plus years. In terms of the actual writing the book, it was about 18 months. I actually thought it'd be much quicker than that. And this is an interesting, because I thought, well, we've written lots of papers, proposals, all sorts of things, different governments and all these things. It shouldn't be too hard. In that, all of that, we've got all the material to piece together. So, it's like I'll piece it together for a few months and clean it up. And it wasn't like that at all, right? So I started doing that and it was like, oh my gosh, we hadn't thought about this particular thing and I hadn't explained this. And then actually I'd quite like to put some anecdotes in because that would seem more interesting about things that I thought, etc., and make it a bit more readable. And so that totally changed it. And so that took me quite a lot longer. And the real tricky thing with this book, and I hope I've managed this, but only readers of it can tell me this. I want to make it readable for, let's say, maths teachers or other people who are sort of, interested in education, whether they're parents or teachers or students themselves, and, somewhat educated people, but not people who have to be real die-hard maths people. I'm not trying to, I'm right to people who can sort of read an everyday, like they would read an everyday science book, for example. On the other hand, I'm really keen to have enough material in it that the policymakers around the world can't turn around and say, hey, you haven't thought about this, you know what you're talking about, etc., etc. So it's got, part one is a little easier than part two, where I've been trying to go through in detail, and part three is again slightly easier to do. So I hope I've gone through that, not fallen between two stools, so to speak, in trying to get that level right.
So this is a book with the cause fundamentally, isn't it? It's kind of, it's a call to action. And so again, just as a reminder, why do you want people to read this book?
Well, there's several reasons, I think, and on several different levels. I mean, I think on one level, many people are curious about maths. Like they didn't like maths, they didn't really understand why they had to do it, what it's done for their lives. And actually, I found a lot of people, both for the book and previous to my TED Talks and things, have said, oh, wow, I'm really excited now. I understand what this was all about. Like this mystery, just a few % of the population has some idea about it. And now somehow you've helped me with that. So that's one level. I think the other one is connected to that is giving people confidence. I mean, one of the problems in the modern world is, in order to be a senior manager or somebody who makes decisions or any of these, in most walks of life, you kind of need some computational thinking to make those decisions increasingly. And if you feel like you're out of that, it's pretty unpleasant. I mean, it's kind of like you're somehow dejected because you can't use this computational thing. So I want to give people some feeling that actually they could get onto that and understand it. Another group which I'm very keen to, is people who've got kids, either because they're teachers or because they've actually got their own kids, and understanding what might be good for them in the future. So it's really, I suppose I want people to get out of it a confidence about what can be done. If you look at policymakers, I am trying to push a cause here. I think that what we've got is really detrimental to humankind right now. We're telling literally billions or hundreds of millions of people around the planet that if you don't understand how to solve a quadratic equation by hand, then somehow you're screwed.
Yeah.
And some people love doing it. I wasn't bad at quadratic equations, but in the end, whether you can do it or not is not the be all and end all of your existence, and not something you're going to use afterwards. So I think we're basically discriminating against a lot of people on the basis of something that isn't really critical to their lives. But I think there is something near that, this computational thinking, that's absolutely critical and that will get us better decisions. And a good example of this is the recent off-qual fiasco with exam grades.
Oh, yes.
I actually wrote a blog post just about this. I'm afraid my central point here was that I think Ofqual and the DFE, Up for Education, and perhaps even the ministers have rather been hoisted by their own petard of their own maths education.
Yeah.
Because what I was arguing is, why did this algorithm, which I think isn't the right description of it anyway, why did the algorithm get screwed up? Well, they didn't ask any of the right questions. They formulated it, I think, in the wrong way, using ideas from the past that are not relevant to a modern computer-based maths era. And up and down the tree of that decision, the people weren't doing computational thinking they ought to have been trained to do at school.
Yeah.
So the curricula that they're insisting everyone learns, because they are the people who made the curriculum in the UK, or at least in England and Wales, that curriculum is what has essentially failed them on making the decision about how the exam grade should work.
Is, as I say, the book is mind-blowing, because as a teacher of of maths, the frustrations, what you're talking, the whole lack of critical computational thinking, and observation of trends as well. One of the issues they came into was they didn't notice what had occurred, which is kind of crazy to think that it would have gone through so many people and then been sent out to like millions of people and no one had noticed that there was kind of an issue. And that's like the issue we have with when I work with students who aren't confident in maths, and they don't give problems a go, they don't notice some of the basic things, and they're not able to kind of communicate what they're thinking. So it's amazing, the whole idea of a subject that tackles something that's essential to everyone,
and also start some problems that they might care about.
Yeah.
So one thing I've also noticed a lot, and maybe you have in your teaching, in a sense, if you've got a very confident background, if you're from a sort of, you've got parents who are pushing you and et cetera, you tend to have more initial ability to push through abstract things you didn't know why you were doing. Not necessarily you're any better at abstraction, just that you've got a bit of extra confidence there.
100%.
And so when you present mathematics, as is done traditionally in the curriculum, as okay, go off and, to use my own example, solve this quadratic equation. I've got no idea why I'm doing this, right? It's got no connection with my life, right? I don't give a toss, basically, right? It's kind of like, if you're sort of from a confident background, it's more likely you'll push through that and get to eventually perhaps discover why you might use any of this stuff. So again, it's kind of an equity problem, because by starting from the very abstract end of this, we tend to exclude people who actually might be really good computational thinkers. It's just that they want to start from something they understand to do with their lives. And that's the whole point. We're trying to make decisions in our lives using mathematics as a technique, effectively. That's sort of what you want it to do. So if we're not starting at that point, why can't we do that? And that's part of what I'm also arguing in the book. But the crucial thing that people miss, particularly people in Department for Education, things like that, the crucial thing they miss is that you can't use maths for much of modern life the way we do in the outside world unless you use computers. The problems are too messy, there's too much data, the wrong techniques. And so if you don't allow computers, people are only learning these other techniques that they really can't apply except for billiard balls or whatever they do in maths problems.
So this is, as I say, thoroughly enjoyed reading it, but it did kind of blow my mind a bit. So with this kind of series, I want if the reader decides to put the viewer, the listener decides to read your book, what do you want them to do afterwards?
That's a great question. Look, I think that first thing is I just want to make sure they can get help for themselves or their children in becoming slightly better computational thinkers. And in fact, in the appendix, there are some very specific things you might do. So one of them is we have a poster with the 4 steps. I think it's really good to think about how problems you're solving fit with these 4 steps and get confident at those. There are actual modules and things we've put out which you can try, and that might be useful. So they're very practical things. I think for teachers, parents, students, this sort of the poster and trying the modules is a great practical thing actually to do. I think really, though, it's sort of opening your eyes, because even if you're a teacher trying to teach traditional mathematics that you have to from the curriculum, I think having the idea of what it's all for and that it's actually important and that you can put it in a bigger context is, I hope, really helpful to people. And so I want them to be able to use that wider sort of thinking in their teaching. So that's that level. I think the other level is we all need to get together to get the system changed. Right. Now, obviously, if you happen to be a policy person, then wonderful. You could actually maybe start to influence it from that position. If you're not, if you're an individual, one thing we started is this campaign, the campaign for core computational curriculum change. And we'd love it if you could just, if you agree with this, just add your name to that online, because that will hopefully, if we get lots and lots of people saying, you know what, and we've put sort of five tenets of that campaign that in the last chapter of my book, actually, that we'd like, if you can agree with that, then it would really help, because we can take a big set of people off to the policymakers. We can say, you know what, there are a lot of people who actually think this should change. And I think also just talk around to lots of other people about whether you really want your children learning what they've learned, why it was you did maths, and whether you've ever actually used it in the way it is, and whether there's a subject that you really could use. And so really get that conversation going, whether it's in the school or between you and your children, or if you're at a university, whether actually we've been complaining for years that the people who came in to do bioscience didn't have the right maths, and we've been putting on a course for this. So maybe we should start putting pressure on the schools to produce the right maths, which will put pressure on the curriculum authorities.
Wow, so this is, I mean, it's kind of something for everyone, it sounds like, in the kind of, it's a book not just for maths teachers, or it's much bigger, but it's kind of action for many people. Are you hopeful? Because it's quite a big, what your suggestion is,
a huge
kind of change and shift. Are you hopeful?
Look, I mean, if you're asking in 30 years' time, do I think this will have changed? Yes. If you're asking, can I predict in 3.5 years the following will have happened in England and Wales? That's very difficult. And can I exactly say what the path is? I think this is one of these things where it's got to change, or as I say in the book, or there's going to be a big blow up. And I would like it to change in an ordered, sensible fashion. If it doesn't, it will just come adrift. And I mean, it's not exactly the same thing, but there was a precedent here with Latin. I mean, it is crazy now to think that if you were in the 1950s in England and you wanted to go to a top university, you had to have a Latin A level, right?
Yeah.
And so, if you wanted to read biology at Oxford, you had to have a Latin A level. And one wonders why exactly this was, right? It sort of seems slightly nuts now. And that's kind of where we are, I think, with maths. It's kind of like, but the difference with maths is there is a subject very close to that we desperately need. It's just not quite the same thing. So it's not like, I mean, Latin is like kind of like, well, we need people to speak English rather than Latin and things. So I feel like this, and in the Latin, what happened with Latin was, I think in the late 50s or early 60s, people would say it's the bedrock of all intellectual understanding schools. The idea that Latin would go is just crazy. It's been around for hundreds of years, just mad as a mainstream subject in like grammar schools or private schools or, intellectual schools. But yet 15 years later, it was basically dead. I mean, it was a side subject that people take for fun, in a few places. And I think that may well happen with maths, but I think there's a much more ordered way it can happen. So I am hopeful that eventually change will happen. And on the other side, I think we're seeing the effects in society of it not having happened. I mean, we talked about the Ofqual disaster, which is a typical effect of what happens when you don't have computational thinkers making decisions with data.
Wow.
We've had some of this with the COVID response. And I mean, it's interesting, the COVID response. I think some of, like Chief Medical Officer Chris Whitty and things, have been putting out things that are very nuanced, and he's trying to explain in detail. I think some of the public can understand that, and some have real difficulty understanding that because they haven't had any experience of thinking along those ways. That's something that maths ought to be helping with, but realistically it isn't really at the moment. And so we're seeing these consequences start to emerge. So I think change can happen. I can't predict the way it is. I think in each country it'll be a bit different. You know, America, I think the US will tend to be lots of people around the public system of education doing things, which will then eventually get that something happening public. In the UK, it'll be a bit different. I think it's got to be ground up and bottom and top down in the UK, hopefully university led as well. So yeah, I'm hopeful, but not in the very short term. But I think we can improve bits around the edges quite quickly, and hopefully that will help the current generation and also adults. I mean, there's no reason adults can't get into this stuff too.
And they need to, really, don't they?
They need to.
Yeah. Oh, well, thank you so much. I would recommend everyone read it, especially maths teachers, because it's worth remembering why we're doing what we're doing, and also understand that there might be an alternative. There is an alternative. Thank you so much for your time. Yes, keep writing.
Great, thanks. Nice to be here. Thanks for all the good questions.